Immediately after the NFL Combine back in March, we did a simulated offseason here on Locked On Dolphins. Well, the offseason is mostly over, so it's time to look back and see how we did here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase on last-minute tickets with the lowest prices. Guaranteed terms do apply. And we're going to go ahead and crack the knuckles here, because this is fun stuff. This is fun off-season content for me. And we're going to get more in the coming weeks. We got about 5 weeks left of dead air until training camp opens, right? We're going to get into more of the Dolphins scheme and defense. We're getting into the evolutions of the linebacker room. We're getting into the evolutions of the tight end room, all of the ways that that can impact the Dolphins. I'm sure we'll get a weekly Tua Tagovailoa update from somebody somewhere sometime with the contract negotiations. But this is fun for me. And you could probably tell the way I'm cheesing if you're watching on YouTube. But back in March, the beginning of March, we did the annual Offseason Blueprint content, which is a week of here's what I would do from a salary cap perspective. Here are the kinds of free agents that I can foresee fit within the puzzle of what the Dolphins are trying to do. Here's a mock draft. Here's what you could do post June 1st. Here's what your salary cap outlook looks like. And here's what a 53-man roster would look like. And the objective was, this is the path we think the Dolphins are going to take. What can you realistically do with the resources that the Dolphins have? You put your GM hat on, try to be as objective as possible. You try to be as realistic as possible. And you do the entire offseason, and it's a week's worth of content, and it culminates with, here's a 3-year snapshot of what your salary cap outlook looks like with a 53-man roster projection. And it's a lot of fun. But now we're at the point now where some of the post June 1st signings have kind of come, and we're all maybe hoping for one more on the offensive line, but they add a couple of veteran guys that could be meaningful players on your roster. And it's a good chance for us now to sit down and look at what we thought back in March you could achieve realistically versus what actually was achieved. And we're going to do the offensive side of the ball today. Tomorrow, we're going to do the defensive side of the ball. And there's one thing I'd like to note. Projecting player values is hard, especially like open market. You never know what position's going to catch fire, where teams are going to be much more willing to spend than maybe they traditionally would at a position. We're going to talk about one of those with one of the free agent guys that I had pegged, and what I had like, hey, here's my offer that I think you could get a deal done for versus what it actually was. And in the real life scenario, it'd be like, hey, here's my offer, and be like, great, you're the 8th best offer I got. And I'd say, okay, well, yeah, you're probably going to go sign somewhere else then. And that happens for teams, right? We have a target list, but you don't necessarily, I'm not saying this actually did happen with Miami, but I'm saying this player got priced out, even for me, 2 weeks before free agency started, where I ever would have dreamed he would have signed. But I always try to be as conservative as possible as it pertains to like salary cap figures, because I don't want to say, hey, they can put 4 void years on the back of every contract and they can fit all these guys with no questions asked. And the Dolphins, they do some of that. And I think that's reflected in the final product. We're going to look at like what my picks would be for a 53-man roster on the offensive side of the ball versus what the picks were within the offseason blueprint back in early March before anything started. And they did a better job than I did. And you would expect them to, because they have the actual information and they're the ones that are paid millions of dollars to run the team, right? But it's really cool for me, it's less about getting the fine details right, and it's more like the broad brush. How closely did we foresee what was going to happen within the vision of what we thought the offseason was going to look like? How did they execute versus what our expectations were? So we could start this. 3 players on offense that I had pegged to return to Miami with proposed contract values were River Craycraft, Kendall Lamb, and Isaiah Wynn. Those 3 guys are indeed back with the team. This is probably my most accurate stretch that we're going to get into here and now. My proposed contract value for River Craycraft was a minimum contract of 1.125, and he signed a deal for 1.24. So you're $120,000 off there, 123.5. Kendall Lamb, so the figure that we had was a 3-year deal, and the talking point there was you're probably gonna have to double pay to bring him back because of how well he played for you, over 600 snaps. Well, turns out this is the last hurrah for Kendall Lamb, and he's back for 2.575. So they actually got him a little cheaper than what the forecast was, and the same's true for Isaiah Wynn, who I said, I'd bring him back. I don't ideally want him to be penciled in as a starter, but I'd bring him back and the value there was listed at $2 million, and he signed for $1.88 million. So that was a trio of guys from last year's team that you looked at and felt like, between chemistry and performance and depth, you'd like to have all those guys back on modest deals, and the Dolphins did indeed do that. Now, you get into the free agent class in general, and we did hit on one guy. It was Aaron Brewer. But the value was not commensurative to where I would have guessed it would have been. I was guessing he was between $5.5 and $6 million. I had like 2-year, $11 million contract. He got a 3-year, $21 million contract. So that's part of the thing that we are talking about with these forecasting values. Very difficult. I wouldn't have guessed, even with the salary cap growth, that Aaron Brewer's average salary would have been equal to about what Connor Williams got when he signed 2 years ago in Miami to play the center position. But that's Miami's budget for the position. And thematically, I think you can keep that in mind. And it's helpful to keep perspective for the Dolphins and what they are willing to budget for certain positions along the roster along the way. So it's a good start, right? Proposed retained players on offense included River Craycraft, Kendall Lamb, Isaiah Wynn. We were pretty good on those values, but then you also had Aaron Brewer as a hit for you in free agency, although that had an extra year and an extra $2 million per season as it pertained to the actual value of the contract. Now, some players that I had down that they didn't get into, but you had some parallels with players that they chose to actually go after instead, comparing and contrasting those players and what their strengths are and who makes sense for Miami more, who you maybe had a better player, but the economics of it made more sense to go in a different direction. We're going to get into all that kind of stuff next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure that you stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the winning championship formula. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. Bring home the parts you need at the prices you want. It's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge dubs with eBay Motors. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items and exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit available only to U.S. customers. I'll go ahead and pull up, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, this was the offensive side of the ball blueprint for the 2024 Miami Dolphins offseason blueprint. And players are color-coded for how you value the players. We'll go position group by position group and kind of highlight the changes between reality and what I had down. There was a number of rookies from the draft class, and we promoted trading down in the draft class. We promoted picking up an extra day 2 pick by pulling a 3rd round pick from 2025 and trading it. That was cool because that actually did happen too. The Dolphins took a 3rd round pick from 2025 and they moved up, but it was into the 4th round for Jalen Wright, the running back out of Tennessee. More on that in just a minute. Let's finish the free agent class, highlighting Devin Duvernay, a Baltimore Ravens wide receiver. Dolphins just got a different one. He signed Odell Beckham Jr. instead on a deal that was 1 year's $3 million in base salary plus player incentives, many of which are generally perceived to be easily attainable. But Duvernay had him down for a 2-year, $8.5 million contract. The selling point was an added element on special teams. He's one of the better punt returners in the game. I didn't have Braxton Berrios on my 53-man roster as a result. It didn't have him pegged to come back. You say, okay, if we're going to pay for a guy who's a wide receiver, but de facto kind of a high-volume special teams guy, why don't we make it Devin Duvernay? Well, the Dolphins went out and got the Baltimore Ravens wide receiver, but they went out and got the Baltimore Ravens wide receiver who has the ceiling within the 11 personnel passing offense. And the contrast there is my answer to that player was going to be Malachi Corley. Now, of course, in reality, Corley gets drafted by the Jets at number 65 overall, first pick of the 3rd round. And that was a player for me that I had kind of penciled in with one of the picks that you were able to trade for on day 2 in the 90s. So in reality, you'd have been on the board and he'd have been off the board for you anyway. But that was kind of the vision with the wide receiver room, was to get Duvernay as the Berrios replacement and then draft a 3rd wide receiver. Well, and maybe Miami ends up having a player who gets drafted into the forecast with Malik Washington, who was available way later than I ever would have dreamed, when it's all said and done. But for Miami to go out and get a Baltimore Ravens wide receiver, I had to laugh a little bit and be like, oh, okay, I just didn't get the memo on the right one. Now, on the offensive line, Damian Lewis was kind of the other big fish free agent that I had earmarked that I would have loved to have seen the Dolphins make a play for. That did not happen. This dollar amount went to the defensive side of the ball. But I said, I think you could get Damian Lewis to sign for 3 years, $30 million. Joke's on me. He signs for 4 years, $53 million, which is $13.25 million per season with the Carolina Panthers after they already signed Robert Hunt. Now, I didn't have Robert Hunt coming back in the offseason blueprint or Christian Wilkins. And that was understood by the combine that both of those guys were going to test the market. You kind of felt like they were going to be out of your strike zone and stratosphere, and you were kind of at peace with it and say, hey, needs of the many versus the needs of the few, we can get a deeper roster. Well, in reality, what they do end up doing is securing a deeper roster. The other player that I had that was kind of like a popular name for my drumbeat before free agency was Noah Fant. And Noah Fant, I was hoping for an offer at 3 years for $24 million, $8 million per season to get him on the roster. Jonnu Smith's the tight end you in reality end up landing, but you do get the athletic tight end as well. So they spit in my face with the interior offensive line stuff. So if you're anxious about the offensive line, just know I tried with the blueprint. But Jonnu Smith for $4.2 million per season versus Noah Fant for $10.5 per season. That's the reality of those two players in their markets. If you told me that was the difference, I'd probably go on Jonnu Smith too. Do I think the ceiling is significantly higher with Noah Fant? Yeah. Do I think we've seen Noah Fant at his best yet? No, I don't. Do I think we'll see Noah Fant at his best this season, given the wide receiver situation in Seattle? No, I realistically don't think that we will. Could there have been more volume here, especially if Miami didn't go out and sign Odell Beckham in free agency? Yeah, and that was kind of the selling point on Noah Fant. But that market came in a little hotter than maybe I thought that it would too, based off of and he went back to the team that he was with originally. Some of the other big discrepancies between my plan for the offensive side of the ball for the blueprint in early March, the first week of March versus now, they drafted the tackle. I had the offensive lineman down, not just Damian Lewis in free agency. I also had this team drafting Phil Haynes with the 55th overall pick. Christian Haynes, excuse me. In reality, Christian Haynes gets drafted 81st to Seattle. So Miami did have the opportunity to draft him at 55 and chose not to. They draft Patrick Paul at offensive tackle. And that's a really helpful reminder of what this team's ideology is as far as premium positions. And think about first round picks for the Dolphins since 2020, right? There was an offensive tackle, there was a quarterback, and there was a cornerback in 2020 or in 2020. In 2021, there was an edge player and there was a wide receiver. 2021, your first round pick goes to another wide receiver. 2022, your first round pick goes to another edge player. 2023, or I said that was 2022, first round pick went to Tyreek Hill. 2023, first round pick went to Bradley Chubb. 2024 went to another edge rusher in Chop Robinson, right? So it's the investment of the early picks being in premium position players, and they really like their athletes, man. They like the intangibles and the tools. So I didn't have them drafting a tackle. I had them drafting a guard with the intent on having a projected offensive line that was Tron Armstead, Damian Lewis, Aaron Brewer, Phil Haynes, Austin Jackson, with Kendall Lamb and Isaiah Wynn as your primary swing players at both spots on the inside and the outside. That was my vision for the offensive line. Would I take that group over what Miami really got? Yes, but Damian Lewis also averaged $13.25 million per season. Like, he was 33% more expensive than I would have guessed that he was being, and I was trying to put the 20% free agent surcharge on there, and it still surpassed by 33%. So that's one of those ones you tip your cap and you probably find somebody else. Maybe they can still find somebody else. But I do think the peace of mind of having a Tron Armstead heir is not a bad thing. It just doesn't alleviate your interior questions for the here and now. We already kind of outlined rookie wide receiver versus Odell Beckham. We still do not have the Tua Tagovailoa contract extension. We did the show on that yesterday. I'm not going to get into that can of worms again. And Tyreek Hill. I had committed Miami to restructuring Tyreek Hill. And early in the offseason, we felt it was weird that they didn't touch Tyreek Hill's contract. And it comes out, well, the reason why is because Tyreek wants more money and wants to rework that contract. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to just do the restructure when the player is trying to say, hey, before you write me a check, I want more money on the check. So let's figure that out. But that makes it all that much more impressive that Miami, from a salary cap perspective, is sitting at about $16 million in cap space right now, which is where I had them at the start of the season. But they got to the same amount of cap space without touching Tyreek Hill's contract and without opening up salary cap space from Tua Tagovailoa. Now, it would have enabled you to be a little bit more aggressive in your spending if you did those things, and maybe you could have afforded to go out and spend for a Damian Lewis or something else. But it's not like they went cheap on defense, or it's not like they went cheap in general in free agency. They just didn't do supersized contracts. So that's where it's really interesting for me. Now's the time where we got to compare room by room what the blueprint had and what we really do have, and ask ourselves, hey, where are we better than what the blueprint forecasted for us? Where are we not better? And why it broke one way or another. And that's what we're going to finish with here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins before we do the same exact thing on the defensive side of the ball tomorrow, which we're looking forward to. So make sure that you stick with us. Summertime means baseball. NBA Finals. You can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from who's going to hit a home run, who's going to win the start. You can get into some of the WNBA stuff as well. It's $200 to use on everything and anything at FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to win big on your summer bucket list with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We have the Blueprint 53-man roster on offense. And what, based off our current offseason roster, is my current 53-man roster projection. And I would just say this 53-man roster projection, and we're only going to do the offensive side of the ball because it's more about comparing and contrasting. It's not about the actual 53-man projection. But I would just say about the 53-man projection, this sucks because I got about 61 guys I want to keep on the roster. And the only out that I did take was I have Bradley Chubb starting the season on one of the reserve lists. So, like, he's on the list, but he's not really on the list. So I really have 54 players, but one of them expecting to not be available for the first month of the season at least. So that's full disclosure. If you're like, hey, there's not 53 guys here. I know you're not a math guy, Kyle, but we can count by one. I know it's 54. Although I don't think any of these guys on the offensive side of the ball would have been on the chopping block. You tell me. The Blueprint projected 53 had 2 quarterbacks. This in part because of the rules by the competition committee to have a third quarterback that's not on the active roster who could be elevated and active on game days every single week without restriction, that being presumably your Skylar Thompson. So we still have 2 quarterbacks, Tua Tagovailoa and Mike White. At running back, our actual projection right now, you've got to include Alec Ingold at the fullback position, Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane, no-brainers. They just traded a third-round pick for Jalen Wright. He's going to be on here. And then I have Chris Brooks from a special teams perspective, from a cost perspective. Like, you could save a little bit more money moving on from Jeff Wilson. From a salary cap perspective, Savon Ahmed, he got married, I believe, this past weekend. So congratulations to him. Please don't take any offense. I don't have you on the 53 projected 53 roster. This is a really tough group, though, to crack. And the advantage that Chris Brooks has is, of course, that he's an undrafted free agent rookie contract. Brooks made the original forecast, too. The only thing that's different about the running back room is which rookie got selected. It was Mostert, Achane, Ingold, Brooks. And my rookie back off of the mock was Isaac Guerendo from Louisville, and I had him being the pick for the Dolphins at 157. In reality, he went 129 to San Francisco. So it's the right ballpark, but they liked Jalen Wright better. And if you feel like Jalen Wright's a better player, then you can look at what they actually got. And they had a choice of guys and chose Jalen Wright. So it seems like a strong endorsement, but you never know until there's proof of concept these guys get on the field. That's the only difference through running backs and quarterbacks is which rookie was picked. Now, wide receiver, this thing kind of breaks open a little bit more. My current, I'm carrying 6, begrudgingly carrying 6 because I wanted to keep 7, and the numbers are not there. And we kept 6 with the original forecast as well. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, those guys, cornerstone players, right? They're on both the original Blueprint and the updated 53. Odell Beckham, as an adequate level starter at this stage in his career, is better than having a third-round rookie, which was what the forecast had, at wide receiver. In reality, that player wouldn't have been there. You would have had to pick a different wide receiver. Moot point, right? Eric Ezukama makes both forecasts, the current forecast and the pre-offseason forecast. I think there's still plenty of reason for optimism there. He's a little bit of a different body type. He flashed in the preseason. They look like they had some specific things they wanted to do with him. I think him being back and healthy, he'll get another run this year to be that kind of player. Now, the original Blueprint had River Craycraft and Devin Duvernay. We made the decision to bring back Craycraft. Duvernay, we were going to pay a $4 million contract to on an annual basis. What was cool about that one is he actually got 2 years, 8.5, which is what I had on the blueprint. He just got it from Jacksonville. It's their kind of overhaul of their wide receiver room. Craycraft and Duvernay, we are swapping out for Braxton Berrios, who's the player that the Dolphins brought back and made a little bit bigger of an investment in. So it's not a shoe-in, but Berrios has a little bit bigger investment than Craycraft has at this point. So I would give him the nod, especially because he is maybe not a kickoff return element, but still as a punt return guy. Like, I would expect he's probably the favorite to still return punts again this year for Miami. And then I have Malik Washington making the roster. And I know people are excited about Taj Washington. People are excited about some of the rest of this Dolphins depth chart with wide receiver and all of the competitiveness that it's going to provide. And it's going to be a bloodbath trying to figure out who are the guys that do make the roster. But I have Malik Washington on in favor of River Craycraft because Washington was just too good of a value with that 6th round pick for me to envision that he can't contribute immediately and be a valuable player for you. So 2 cornerstones, a quality starter, a quality depth player, an incomplete evaluation, and a rookie in reality, when the original forecast had 2 cornerstones, a rookie, 2 quality depth players, and a incomplete evaluation in Eric Hezukama. So you went from Duvernay and Craycraft versus Odell and Malik Washington and Braxton Berrios with Malachi Corley. I think the reality group at wide receiver is a better group. And it's not like they're paying excessively for Odell Beckham. So that's a job well done. This tight end room, I think the biggest point of emphasis is probably the economics of it, where you have Durham Smythe, who you restructured again. Julian Hill was on the original pre-offseason 53-man forecast from the blueprint. I had them drafting Tip Ryman. This might have been the least accurate assessment from an actual draft perspective, because I had him as one of the Dolphins' last picks in the mock draft. He went in the 3rd round to Arizona. And I guess that's what happens when you're an inline blocker who blocks well and then tests really athletic is you're given a little bit more grace. But Tip Ryman being somebody who in the pre-draft process, we're like, hey, like, maybe you can get this guy to be your inline guy. Well, you weren't going to get him if he was going to go to 82. that was never going to make sense for Miami. So tip of the cap to Arizona. They seem to like poaching Dolphins skill players between Elijah Higgins and Tip Ryman as a late round prospect for us. But you have to imagine if Arizona was willing to draft him that high, he never in a million years would have sniffed the picks that Miami really had in reality. So that makes that group look a little different. And then Jonnu Smith being the reality pick that you get, and the value there is less than half of the cost of what Noah Fant really cost, and half of the cost of what the Blueprint's budget was for Noah Fant. And that was 3 years, $24 million was that proposed contract. So Jonnu Smith at half the cost, yeah, you take it. Now, this is where the cuts get ugly because Miami also brought in Jody Fortson. And Julian Hill was the last player off for me to get to 54 with an asterisk because Bradley Chubb's on IR. And Chris Brooks might be the next guy off if Bradley Chubb were to be ready for the start of the season. Just full transparency. Tight end's really nasty. That's a very heavily competitive room. Obviously, Julian Hill played meaningful snaps for you last year. He played over 300 snaps offensively. Looked like he kind of got it a little bit. But Jonnu, as a passing game weapon player who, frankly, is in the same bucket as what Noah Fant has been able to show in Seattle, I think the ceiling is higher for Noah Fant. Like, I could have seen Noah Fant in this offense being a quality starter, but based off of what we know right now, he's an adequate level starter. Jonnu Smith, guess what? He's a quality starter, or he's an adequate starter, excuse me. They're in the same bucket of classification of players for half the cost. Then you have Durham Smythe and Jody Fortson being the other big-bodied receiving weapon that I'm a little less inclined to put a lot of value in the blocking tight end because you carry the fullback with Alec Ingold. I assume you'd probably get Julian Hill on the practice squad. I can't imagine as a guy out of Campbell who played 300 snaps for you last year, in a position where there's guys that are long-term vets that are walking around as street free agents all the time, that you couldn't stash Julian Hill in the practice squad. And it would honestly be a risk I'd be willing to take. I would not let Jody Fortson go, because that's a player who, you watch the tape, the talent is painfully obvious. And that was not a player that was necessarily on my radar as like, hey, let's go get this kind of player. But if Fortson's healthy, between Fortson and Ezukama, you can do some really nice matchup things with size. And like, Fortson can play. It's been injuries have been the issue for Jody Fortson. So it's a 3-player tight end room with Jonnu Smith, Durham Smythe, and Jody Fortson, an adequate level starter, and then 2 quality depth players in Smythe and Fortson, as compared to the original forecast had Noah Fant, who was graded as an adequate starter, Durham Smythe, of course, Julian Hill is an incomplete evaluation with only 300 career NFL snaps offensively, and a rookie in Tip Ryman, who ends up being in reality a day 2 pick. I think the economics of this room and the X factor element of Jody Fortson as being an all-around player versus Julian Hill, of course, it's pie in the sky to say, hey, well, we love the room with Tip Ryman because he ended up being a day 2 pick, but that wasn't the value of where you got him in the mock draft, so you can't count on him actually making the roster. And that's the hard part about doing everything so early on, right? You do the entire offseason before a single player signs in free agency, and every move you make impacts 6 other pawns on the board. It's a lot of layers to it. But offensive line is where we need to finish here. And this is definitively the only group that I emphatically feel like where Miami was at in the blueprint is better, and it was a realistic outcome. Because you could have gone up and juiced the numbers for Damian Lewis, especially if you move the Tyreek Hill money around. Now, in the reality of the world where you didn't move the Tyreek Hill money around, could you still have fit 4 years, 53? I think in lieu of transitioning and adding, if you were to have gone cheap at linebacker instead of giving the 3 years, 30 to Jordan Brooks at linebacker, which is that's approximately what that value contract is at. I guess it was 3 years, 26 and a quarter is the reality of that contract. So if you took that budget and you applied it to the interior offensive line, could you have maybe swung it? Yeah, I do. Do you get the sense that they really care about it? No. But we hit on Aaron Brewer, and that came in a little bit above budget, but nevertheless, we hit on Aaron Brewer as a pick for this team. Haynes was there to have been drafted at 55, so it's not like you could say, oh, well, he got drafted at a spot where it's never going to make sense for Miami. He was on the board with the pick the Dolphins had, and they chose to go with Patrick Paul instead. But a starting lineup with the original blueprint projected offensive line of Armstead, Lewis, Brewer, Haynes, Jackson, with Kendall Lamb, Isaiah Wynn, Liam Eichenberg, and Keon Smith making the roster. That group I'd have been really fired up for, because I think that would have given you some linear athleticism and maulers up front. And in the reality, you have Teron Armstead at left tackle. You have Isaiah Wynn, who was your utility 6th offensive lineman in the original blueprint, who's now as a starter at left guard. And you know that there's an injury question there that exists. You do have Aaron Brewer at center, like you did in the blueprint. You have Austin Jackson at right tackle. That other guard spot right now is Liam Eichenberg, Jack Driscoll, question mark. I don't have Robert Jones on either one. I don't have Lester Cotton on either the original or the current projected 53. I think you can make a case for 10 offensive linemen. I only have 9. It's Armstead, Wynn, Brewer, Eichenberg, Jackson as left to right starters, Kendall Lamb and Patrick Paul as tackles. Then I have Jack Driscoll, and I still want to hold on to Keon Smith. Now, maybe they keep Robert Jones over Keon Smith, and that's how you keep 9. But there's a world in which you would justify and want to justify keeping both. And that's for the offensive line, where the numbers game just gets messy, and the guys that have the versatility in their back pocket, it's nice to know you can fall back on that, because they're going to let somebody go that's going to be on somebody else's 53. Is Keon Smith the most likely one for you to stash on the practice squad because he's only played 70 career offensive snaps? Yeah. Am I still really enthralled with Keon Smith? Yeah. In reality, if I'm being totally objective and I take my bias for Keon Smith versus some of my concerns for Robert Jones out as far as a fit within the scheme, is Keon Smith now is your de facto fifth tackle, a little less valuable? Yeah. But can he play inside? He's gotten some looks inside a guard. And if he can take that step, then I think that puts him in a great place because like Robert Jones is exclusively a guard. Everybody else, though, on the actual blueprint, Teron Armstead is a position exclusive player. Aaron Brewer can play guard. He's an exponentially better center than guard, though. Isaiah Wynn can play guard and tackle. Liam Eichenberg play all 5 spots. Austin Jackson can play guard and tackle. Kendall Lamb theoretically can play guard and tackle, but at the very least, he can play both sides of the offensive line at tackle. Jack Driscoll can play guard tackle and got some cross-training looks at center. Keon Smith, potentially cross-train guard tackle. There's a lot of guys that can do a lot of things. And that's, for me, maximizing the offensive line with the guys that we have as compared to paying premium dollars for guys and premium picks for guys that are interior players like Damian Lewis and Christian Haynes. That's the big divide. But everything else offensively, like, hey, we want to improve the tight end room. Hey, we want to improve the wide receiver room. Hey, we want to get another body in the running back room with a mid-round draft pick. Hey, we want to have more positional flexibility with what we have along the offensive line. All of those things were fairly parallel from the original forecast to what we got. The way they got there was different. But anytime that I can do a project like that, and thematically, I get it. I get where they're trying to go. It's nice confirmation for me that you're processing what they're trying to do and the why of why they're trying to do it. Now, we have the defensive side of the ball to spotlight tomorrow. We'll also kind of highlight, and this is, we alluded to it already to some degree, but the biggest development from the offseason blueprint to what we really have, and this further outlines, I think, why Miami should get a little grace for the negotiations they're working on with Tua. They're in a much healthier salary cap situation right now than what I had in the blueprint, and I felt pretty good about what they had in the blueprint. Like, and again, they didn't touch Tyreek Hill's contract, and they did not max restructure Bradley Chubb's contract, and that means a lot for 2025. We'll get into all that tomorrow on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you stick with us. I appreciate you guys checking the show. Make it a great rest of your day. Fins up. We are out of here.